First contact gone wrong. The vast command chamber of the Nexari flagship Dominion's edge hummed with the quiet efficiency of a machine built for conquest. Supreme Commander Zethrak stood before the massive viewing screen, his forearms crossed behind his chitinous back as he observed the small blue-green planet rotating slowly in the void. His silver eyes, each the size of a human fist, reflected the cold light of distant stars. "Report," Zethrak commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never tasted defeat. The sound echoed through his throat chambers, creating a harmonic that made lesser beings tremble. Navigator Kelth, a smaller Nexari with copper-tinted carapace, approached with data tablets clutched in her secondary arms. "Supreme Commander, the third planet in this system shows signs of intelligent life. They call themselves humans." She pronounced the word with visible distaste, as if it left a bitter taste in her translator. Zethrak turned, his massive form casting shadows across the command deck. At nearly 3 meters tall and built like a living weapon, he was the perfect representation of Nexari supremacy. "Intelligence level. Primitive," Kelth replied without hesitation. "They still use chemical propulsion for space travel. Their strongest weapons are crude nuclear devices. Most fascinating is their biological makeup. They're incredibly fragile. Soft skin, single hearts, no natural armor. A slight pressure change could kill them." A low rumble emanated from Zethrak's chest, the Nexari equivalent of laughter. "And their military capabilities. Divided into hundreds of smaller territorial groups. They engage in constant conflicts among themselves over resources that could be synthesized in any decent laboratory. Our analysts estimate complete subjugation within 72 standard hours." Zethrak walked to the tactical display, where Earth rotated in miniature holographic form. Cities glowed like scattered jewels across the continents, unaware of the doom hanging over them. 72 hours seems generous for such a backward species. Reduce it to 24. "Yes, Supreme Commander," Kelth replied, though something in her tone suggested uncertainty. "There is one unusual finding. Their information networks are surprisingly sophisticated, and they produce an enormous amount of what appears to be fictional combat scenarios. Entertainment, our analysts believe. Entertainment about war." Zethrak's secondary arms gestured dismissively. Typical of a primitive species, they romanticize what they cannot truly understand. He paused at the navigation console, inputting coordinates with practiced precision. "Prepare the announcement. Let the galaxy witness another successful integration into the Nexari Empire." Meanwhile, 3 billion kilometers away, the routine of Earth's morning was interrupted by something unprecedented. Dr. Marcus Rivera sat in his cluttered office at the Global Defense Consortium's headquarters in Geneva, staring at readings that shouldn't exist. Coffee had gone cold in his mug hours ago, but he hadn't noticed. The man who had dedicated his life to SETI research was finally seeing what he'd always hoped for, and dreaded. "Admiral Chen," Rivera said into his communicator, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "You need to see this immediately." Admiral Sarah Chen arrived within minutes, her sharp features set in the expression of someone accustomed to crisis management. At 52, she had led Earth's United Defense Forces through 3 major conflicts and countless smaller skirmishes. Her presence alone seemed to steady the nervous energy in Rivera's lab. "Show me," she said simply. Rivera's hands moved across multiple holographic displays, pulling up data streams and analysis reports. "We detected them 18 hours ago. A massive fleet, holding position at the edge of the Kuiper Belt. Their technology is, well, it's everything we theorized alien technology might be. Energy signatures we can barely comprehend, propulsion systems that seem to bend space itself." Chen studied the data with the cold calculation of a career military officer. "Numbers. At least 300 vessels, ranging from what appear to be scouts to something the size of Manhattan." "But Sarah," Rivera's voice dropped, "they're not hiding. This isn't reconnaissance. This is a fleet preparing for battle. Before Chen could respond, every screen in the facility flickered and went dark. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, slowly, an image resolved, the interior of an alien command chamber, dominated by a towering figure that could only be described as a living weapon. Supreme Commander Zethrak spoke, and the facility's translation system struggled to keep pace with this complex harmonic language. People of Earth, I am Supreme Commander Zethrak of the Nexari Empire. Your primitive civilization has been evaluated and found lacking in the fundamental requirements for independent existence. Rivera felt his blood turn to ice, but Chen's expression remained unchanged. She was already calculating, already planning. Your species demonstrates the chaotic tendencies typical of underdeveloped races, Zethrak continued. You wage war among yourselves, waste resources, and lack the discipline necessary for galactic citizenship. Therefore, the Nexari Empire formally declares your world a protectorate. Surrender your weapons, dismantle your governments, and submit to integration. You have 24 Earth hours to comply. The transmission ended, leaving Rivera's lab in stunned silence. 24 hours, Rivera whispered. Sarah, we're not ready for this. Our most advanced fighters are barely capable of reaching orbit. Their smallest ships could probably destroy entire cities. Admiral Chen walked to the window overlooking the city below. People moved through their daily routines, unaware that their entire way of life hung in the balance. Marcus, how long have we been preparing for this day? Preparing. Rivera looked confused. Sarah, nobody could prepare for something like this. Chen turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Project Prometheus, Marcus. Theoretical defense against extraterrestrial threats. We've been running simulations for 15 years. Simulations aren't reality. Rivera protested. Even our best theoretical responses assumed we have months or years to prepare, not hours. Who said we only had hours? Chen moved to Rivera's communication panel and began entering authorization codes he'd never seen before. Marcus, what's the one thing every military leader fears most? I don't understand. An enemy who isn't what they appear to be. The panel beeped, and suddenly Rivera's screens came alive with data he didn't recognize. Orbital platforms that shouldn't exist. Weapon systems that weren't in any public database. Manufacturing facilities hidden in plain sight. Most shocking of all, a vast network of underground installations that seemed to span the globe. This is impossible, Rivera breathed. The energy requirements alone, the construction. When did we build all this? We didn't build it, Chen replied, her fingers dancing across controls that moments before had been displaying routine scientific data. We've been growing it. Marcus, do you remember the Tunguska event? The unexplained satellite launches. The deep-sea mining operations that never made economic sense. Rivera's scientific mind began making connections he never allowed himself to consider. You're telling me that for over a century, humanity has been secretly preparing for alien invasion. Not invasion. Contact. We always hoped it would be peaceful, but we planned for the alternative. Chen's expression grew grim. What we didn't plan for was having so little time. Across the globe, similar scenes played out in hidden facilities. In the Sahara Desert, sand dunes shifted to reveal massive launch bays. Beneath the Pacific Ocean, what appeared to be underwater research stations transformed into weapons platforms. In Earth's orbit, communications satellites shed their disguises and revealed themselves as the first line of defense. Captain Jorik of the Nexari Advanced Scout Fleet observed these developments with growing unease. What his sensors had initially dismissed as primitive infrastructure was revealing layers of complexity that shouldn't exist. Energy signatures were spiking across the planet's surface, and orbital space was becoming increasingly crowded with objects that hadn't been there hours before. Commander, he reported to the flagship, the humans are displaying unexpected levels of organization. Their response time suggests pre-existing defense protocols. Zethrak's image appeared on Jorik's screen, and the Supreme Commander's expression was one of mild irritation. "Captain, they're throwing their primitive weapons at us in desperation. Proceed with Phase 1 as planned." "Yes, Supreme Commander, but no exceptions, Captain. The galaxy must see that the Nexari Empire's judgment is final." Jorik closed the channel, but his unease remained. He'd conquered 17 worlds for the Empire, and never had he seen a species respond with such coordinated efficiency. Most civilizations fell into chaos when faced with superior force. These humans were doing something else entirely. Lieutenant Emma Torres felt the familiar weight of acceleration as her fighter launched from the hidden base beneath Mount McKinley. The craft around her looked nothing like the atmospheric fighters the public knew about. This was something else, a fusion of human engineering and technologies that shouldn't have existed for another century. "Dragon Squadron, this is Control," came the voice in her headset. "You are authorized to engage targets of opportunity. Remember, we're not just fighting for Earth. We're showing them what happens when you underestimate the human spirit." Tori smiled grimly as her heads-up display locked onto the approaching Nexari scouts. "Copy. Control. Time to give our visitors a proper Earth welcome." The first engagement lasted 37 seconds. Taurus and her squadron struck like lightning, using tactics that combined human unpredictability with technology that matched the Nexari's own. When the brief battle ended, 12 Nexari scout vessels had been destroyed, and not a single human fighter was lost. Captain Jorik stared at his tactical display in shock. The humans had used some kind of stealth technology he'd never encountered, striking from multiple vectors simultaneously. Their weapons were crude but effective, and their pilots displayed a level of skill that defied their supposed primitive nature. "All units, return to formation," he ordered, his voice tight with concern. "Prepare full analysis of human capabilities." But even as he gave the order, Jorik knew that the analysis would be incomplete. These humans had shown them only a fraction of what they were capable of, and already his confidence in the Nexari's swift victory was cracking. Back on the flagship, Supreme Commander Zethrak reviewed the engagement reports with growing anger. "Explain to me," he demanded of his tactical officer, "how a primitive species destroyed 12 of our vessels." "Supreme Commander, their technology appears more advanced than initial assessments suggested. They employed coordinated strike patterns and weapons that approached our own specifications." Zethrak's primary arms clenched into fists. "Impossible. Our intelligence was thorough." "Perhaps," the tactical officer suggested carefully, "our intelligence was shown what they wanted us to see." For the first time in his career, Supreme Commander Zethrak felt something he'd never experienced before: doubt. But he pushed it aside, as he'd been trained to do since childhood. The Nexari Empire had never been defeated, and it wouldn't start with a species of soft-skinned primitives. "Prepare the full assault," he commanded. "If they want to resist, they'll learn why the galaxy fears the Nexari name." But deep in the underground command center beneath Geneva, Admiral Chen watched the tactical displays with satisfaction. The first phase was complete. The Nexari had revealed their capabilities, shown their arrogance, and demonstrated their fatal flaw. They believed their own propaganda about human weakness. "Marcus," she said to Dr. Rivera, who was still staring in amazement at the hidden technology surrounding them, "how long did our simulations predict it would take to defeat a force like this?" Rivera checked his calculations. "With conventional weapons and tactics, impossible. They outgun us by several orders of magnitude. And with unconventional weapons and tactics." Rivera's expression slowly changed as understanding dawned. "Sarah, you're not talking about winning through superior firepower. You're talking about winning because they don't understand what they're fighting." Admiral Chen nodded, her eyes fixed on the enemy fleet positions. "Marcus, throughout human history, what's been our greatest advantage against superior opponents? Adaptability, innovation, the refusal to accept defeat." "Exactly. And in about 6 hours, The Nexeri are going to learn why underestimating humanity is the last mistake most species ever make. As Earth's hidden defenses continued their preparations and the Nexeri fleet moved into attack formation, neither side fully understood what was about to unfold. The Nexeri saw only primitive opponents who had scored a lucky victory. The humans saw only the first test of preparations that had been generations in the making. But both sides were about to discover that this war would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. What they didn't know about humans. The second wave came at dawn, Pacific Standard Time, just as Admiral Chen had predicted. Supreme Commander Zethrak had deployed his full assault force, 200 vessels in perfect formation, energy weapons charged and ready to turn Earth's cities into molten craters. What he encountered instead changed everything he thought he knew about warfare. Dr. Marcus Rivera watched from the command center as the Nexeri fleet approached Earth's atmosphere. Around him, dozens of operators worked at stations that hours before had been disguised as routine monitoring equipment. The transformation still amazed him. Humanity's greatest secret revealed in its moment of greatest need. "Admiral," reported Commander Hayes from the tactical station, "Nexeri forces are assuming standard bombardment formation. They're targeting major population centers first." Admiral Chen stood at the center of the organized chaos, her calm presence anchoring everyone around her. "Activate the Aurora Protocol." Rivera had helped design Aurora in theory, but seeing it implemented was breathtaking. Across Earth's surface, installations that had masqueraded as research facilities for decades revealed their true nature. The massive particle accelerator beneath Switzerland wasn't just for physics research, it was a planet-wide defensive grid. The deep-sea mining platforms weren't extracting resources, they were generating the power needed to fuel humanity's secret weapons. Lieutenant Emma Torres received her new orders as she piloted her fighter through the upper atmosphere. "Dragon Squadron, this is Control. You are now operating under Aurora Protocol. All restrictions are lifted. Show them what Earth really looks like when she's angry." Torres had trained for this moment her entire career, but she'd never imagined she'd feel so calm. Around her, the sky filled with fighters that emerged from hidden bays across the globe. Not the primitive craft the Nexeri expected, but sleek vessels that moved with impossible grace through the atmosphere and beyond. Captain Jorik observed the human response from his command vessel and felt his confidence evaporate completely. The energy signatures emerging from Earth's surface were beyond anything in the Nexeri database. These weren't the desperate attacks of a primitive species, they were the calculated responses of a civilization that had been preparing for this exact scenario. "All units, evasive maneuvers," he ordered, but even as he spoke, the first wave of human counterattack reached his fleet. What happened next defied every tactical assumption the Nexeri had ever made. The humans didn't fight like any species the Nexeri had encountered. Instead of meeting force with force, they used Earth's own atmosphere as a weapon. Massive energy projectors hidden in polar installations created electromagnetic pulses that disrupted Nexeri guidance systems. Orbital platforms that had posed as communication satellites revealed themselves as kinetic bombardment systems, launching projectiles that moved too fast for Nexeri sensors to track. But the real shock came when the humans employed what they called gravitational warfare. The deep space monitoring stations that had watched the galaxy for decades weren't just observers, they were manipulators. Using technology that the Nexeri barely understood, humanity had learned to create localized gravity wells, turning space itself into a weapon. Supreme Commander Zethrak watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos. His ships, designed to dominate through superior firepower, found themselves caught in gravity traps that pulled them off course and into each other. Energy weapons that should have devastated human cities instead struck empty air as the humans used stealth technology that bent light itself. "How is this possible?" he demanded of his tactical officer. Intelligence reported these beings were barely capable of spaceflight. "Supreme Commander," the officer replied, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, I believe our intelligence was deliberately fed false information. These humans, they've been preparing for our arrival. The truth was even more complex than the Nexeri realized. Humanity hadn't just been preparing for alien contact. They'd been preparing for a specific type of contact. Every fictional story, every military simulation, every what-if scenario had contributed to a vast database of possibilities. When the moment came, humanity didn't panic because they'd already imagined it 1,000 times. Dr. Rivera coordinated the scientific response from his command post, watching as human ingenuity turned the tide of battle. Admiral, the gravitational disruptors are working beyond projections. The Nexeri ships aren't designed to handle variable gravity fields. What about their adaptation capabilities? Chen asked, never taking her eyes off the tactical display. That's just it, Rivera replied with growing excitement. They don't seem to have any. They're built for overwhelming force against predictable opponents. They've never faced an enemy that changes tactics mid-battle. This was humanity's secret weapon, not superior technology, but superior adaptability. While the Nexeri followed predetermined battle plans, human commanders were improvising in real time, using creativity and intuition that no alien species had ever encountered. Lieutenant Torres discovered this firsthand as she engaged a Nexeri heavy cruiser. Her fighter's weapons couldn't penetrate its shields directly, so she did something the Nexeri couldn't predict. She improvised. Using her fighter's gravitational manipulators, she created a localized black hole that lasted just long enough to collapse the cruiser's shield harmonics. The brief vulnerability was all she needed. "Control, this is Dragon Leader," she reported. "Confirmed kill on heavy cruiser. These guys don't know how to handle asymmetric warfare." Captain Jorik's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Half his fleet was disabled or destroyed, and the humans showed no signs of slowing down. Worse, they seemed to be learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics faster than his forces could respond. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving surrender requests from 12 of our vessels. They're requesting permission to withdraw." Jorik stared at the tactical display in disbelief. Nexeri forces didn't surrender. They didn't retreat. They conquered or died in the attempt. But these humans had done something impossible. They'd broken the psychological foundation of Nexeri military doctrine. "Granted," he said quietly. "All units are authorized to withdraw to safe distance." The message reached Supreme Commander Zethrak as he watched his invasion force crumble. For the first time in Nexeri history, they were not just losing a battle. They were being systematically dismantled by opponents they'd dismissed as irrelevant. "Supreme Commander," Captain Jorik's voice came through the communication system, heavy with shame. "Request permission to withdraw remaining forces. Human capabilities were severely underestimated. They're not just defending. They're hunting us." Zethrak wanted to refuse, to order his forces to fight to the last ship. But the tactical data was undeniable. The humans weren't just winning through luck or desperation. They were demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that surpassed even Nexeri military academies. "Granted," he said finally. "All forces withdraw to rally point 7. But the humans weren't finished. As the Nexeri fleet began its retreat, Admiral Chen gave an order that would echo through galactic history. "All units, pursuit formation. Time to show them what happens when you threaten Earth." What followed wasn't just a military victory. It was a lesson in human nature that the Nexeri would never forget. Instead of simply driving off the invasion force, humanity pursued them beyond Earth's solar system, not to destroy, but to understand. They captured disabled Nexeri vessels not for their technology, but to treat wounded aliens with the same care they'd give their own people. Dr. Rivera found himself face to face with a captured Nexeri officer, a young captain named Verix, whose ship had been disabled rather than destroyed. The alien sat in the medical bay, his chitinous armor scared, but his injuries carefully tended by human medical staff. "Why?" Verix asked through the translator. "We came to conquer your world. We would have enslaved your people. Why do you heal our wounds? Rivera considered the question carefully. Because that's what humans do. We fight when we have to. But we don't make enemies when we can make friends instead. The concept seemed to confuse the Nexari officer. But we are your enemies. We declared war on your species. You declared war on what you thought we were, Rivera corrected. You never asked what we actually were. Supreme Commander Zethrak received the final battle reports in his private quarters, away from the crew that had watched their supposedly invincible fleet defeated by a species they'd dismissed as primitive. The data painted a picture that challenged everything the Nexari Empire believed about itself. The humans had used approximately 12% of their defensive capabilities. 12%. The rest remained hidden, suggesting a military potential that rivaled the greatest powers in the galaxy. More disturbing was the pattern analysis. Every human tactical decision showed evidence of long-term strategic thinking that spanned generations. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. Zethrak expected a report from his surviving captains, but instead found himself looking at Admiral Chen, sitting calmly in what appeared to be a comfortable office rather than a military command center. Supreme Commander Zethrak, she said, her voice carrying none of the triumph he'd expected. I believe we need to talk. You wish to dictate terms of surrender? Zethrak asked, though he already knew the answer would surprise him. I wish to prevent a war that doesn't need to happen, Chen replied. Your forces attacked us because you believed we were a threat to galactic peace. You were partly right, but not in the way you thought. Chen gestured, and the transmission expanded to show other figures, scientists, diplomats, engineers, all human but representing a diversity that seemed impossible for a single species. We're not a threat because we're warlike, Commander. We're a potential threat because we're adaptable. But that same adaptability makes us the best possible allies. Zethrak found himself leaning forward despite his instincts. Explain. Your empire spans hundreds of worlds, but every world follows the same patterns, the same solutions, the same thinking. You've achieved peace through uniformity. Chen's expression grew serious. But what happens when you encounter a problem that uniform thinking can't solve? What happens when adaptability becomes more valuable than consistency? The question struck at the heart of Zethrak's private fears. The Nexari Empire was vast and powerful, but it was also rigid. They'd conquered through superior force and maintained control through superior organization. But they'd never faced a challenge that required them to change. What are you proposing? He asked. Partnership, Chen said simply. Not subjugation, not conquest. An alliance between equals. You provide stability and resources. We provide innovation and adaptability. Together, we could explore possibilities that neither of our species could achieve alone. Dr. Rivera watched the historic conversation from the command center, still amazed by the day's revelations. Humanity had revealed its greatest secret not just to defend itself, but to transform potential enemies into allies. It was the most human response imaginable, turning conflict into cooperation. Lieutenant Torres landed her fighter at the hidden base beneath Mount McKinley, exhausted but exhilarated. She'd fought in humanity's first interstellar war and lived to tell about it. More importantly, she'd helped prove that humans weren't just survivors. They were transformers, turning every challenge into an opportunity for growth. The conversation between Admiral Chen and Supreme Commander Zethrak continued for hours, laying the groundwork for agreements that would reshape the galaxy. But the real victory wasn't military or diplomatic. It was the demonstration that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology or tactics, but the refusal to accept limitations. As Earth's sun set on a day that changed everything, the hidden installations began powering down, their defensive systems returning to their disguised states. But the secret was out now. Humanity had shown the galaxy what they really were, not conquerors or victims, but partners in the greatest adventure of all, the exploration of infinite possibility. Supreme Commander Zethrak concluded his report to the Nexari High Council with words he never expected to write. Recommendation: full alliance with human species. They represent not a threat to galactic stability, but an opportunity for galactic evolution. We came to judge them, and found ourselves judged instead, not by their weapons, but by their wisdom. The war that lasted one day ended not with surrender, but with understanding. And in the years that followed, when other species asked how humanity had defeated the mighty Nexari Empire, the answer was always the same. They didn't defeat them. They did something far more human. They changed them. In the end, that was what the galaxy learned about humanity. They weren't the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but they were something far more dangerous and far more valuable. They were the species that refused to accept that anything was impossible, and once the galaxy understood that, everything changed.